Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us for this program we're doing tonight, Grief and Aspects of the African American Experience. My name is Iana Woods, and I am the Executive Director of End of Life Choices New York. Before turning it over to our wonderful speaker, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our organization and go over some logistics for tonight. So End of Life Choices New York is a small nonprofit organization. We are the leading organization in New York working to improve end-of-life care and expand end-of-life options to ensure a peaceful death. We do this in a couple of ways. We pursue legal and legislative reform to expand end-of-life options and ensure a patient's right to a peaceful death. We also educate the public and healthcare professionals, such as this program tonight, on various end-of-life issues. We offer CEUs to social workers, and we plan to launch an end-of-life certificate program in the fall. So keep a lookout for that for those of you who are interested in learning more about this topic for professional reasons. And we also provide free counseling and support to people who are preparing advance directives, caring for terminally ill loved ones, and who are approaching the end of life themselves. So for more information about End of Life Choices New York, I encourage you to visit our website. That's endoflifechoicesny.org. You can also follow us on social media through Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And after the talk, there will be time to answer your questions. So to ask a question throughout the program as Rashida is talking tonight, you can type it in the Q&A box at any time. So if any question comes into your mind, please type it in at that time. We'll get to it at the end. And then we'll share a recording of this program once it's done so you can share it with others. So without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce our speaker, Ms. Rashida Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez currently works in the role of bereavement counselor at Calvary Hospital and Hospice. She facilitates bereavement groups for children and teens and adults who are processing a variety of deaths. She's not only passionate about working with her clients, but also interested in how bereavement and grief can be viewed through the lens of social justice. She looks forward to continuing her contribution to the field of death and dying, exploring topics that aid in the understanding of grief in children and adolescents, immigrant populations, and faith communities. We are thrilled to have her join us today for this very important discussion. Rashida, I turn it to you.
Thank you, Ayana, for that lovely introduction, and good evening to those who may be tuning in from the East Coast, and hello to anyone who is tuning from any other location. So happy to be with you this evening as we really are going to take an overview look, a quick dive into a topic that I'm so passionate about. And I'm very happy to also wish you all a happy Black History Month, specifically being able to intertwine these two subjects of grief and the African American experience has been wonderful, even in doing some research that led up to some of the things that you'll be hearing this evening. I'm just going to give a little overview about grief in general, presenting some terms that I think are important for us to know when we're thinking about grief and other things that may be important in setting up the foundation for our chat this evening. And then I'm going to specifically highlight some things as it pertains to the African American experience. Now, I always love to preface this talk by saying in no way could I cover everything pertaining to every person who identifies as African American, who identifies as Black in the Americas, because we're not monolithic. There are so many different traditions, so many different spiritualities, so many different beliefs about death and dying, in addition to things that we may believe in other aspects of life. So this is just an overview of some of the common things and experiences that I hope to bring to you from those who have had the opportunity to work with over these years that I have been involved in the work of death and dying. So the first thing that I'd like to remind you of or to clarify is grief itself, right? There are so many things that we hear about grief. And I think one of the most common things that comes to mind when people hear that term is they think about deep sadness, they think about loss, they think about death. And grief is all of those things. However, the most simplest definition of grief is a reaction to a loss. I think seeing grief as a reaction to a loss really begins to open up those boundaries that we perhaps had for ourselves and the ways we think about grief in general, not just perhaps as related to death, but related to reactions to all types of loss. So there are two major lines of thinking that may take place, those in which are death related and loss which are non-death related. For the purposes tonight, we're mostly going to look at debt related loss, but I do want to make sure that we look at other types of losses as well, seeing them in the societal context that we're in, because they do have an impact in the way which African Americans grieve the death related losses that they're experiencing. Loss is also universal. Our reactions far and wide in between, and they are not just emotions or on the emotional level, but we each have personal and individual pathways to the way that we grieve. Grief impacts individuals holistically. We really can identify with the emotional part of it, right? But grief also impacts individuals cognitively, spiritually, impacts them physically, existentially. We can go on with the ways that grief impacts individuals. And I want to open up our minds to it just not being about feeling guilty or angry or sad or moving through emotional phases, but really opening up our minds to the many other ways in which we can be impacted. For example, cognitively, I often had clients speaking about how they just can't seem to focus in their workplace anymore, or they are misplacing things, or perhaps they can't keep appointments in order because they just feel so overwhelmed by the great loss that they are experiencing. Physically, people may hold anxiety and feel that within their bodies, in their chest, a racing heartbeats, or may carry pain in their shoulders, or feel like they're getting migraines. So we're expanding sort of our thinking about grief within not just being in the emotional realm, but impacting and affecting people holistically. And grief is also not an event. It's not a one-time thing. Often we speak about the word of closure, but I invited us to think about grief and our reactions to loss as something that can stay with us for months and years. Reactions to loss can transform over time. However, grief does not disappear. And I hope that definition of grief kind of frees us up to really think about not working towards a point of healing, quote unquote, but really leaning into the fact that these reactions that we're having as it pertains to loss can be with us, and we can integrate them into our own lives. This last year, as we are in the midst in the United States of being in the corona COVID-19 pandemic for about 1 year, we have as a nation experienced such a great deal of loss of lives, but also losses of many, many other things in the time of pandemic. I want to invite you to look at that term, secondary loss. Now, it's not referring to loss that is less noteworthy than death-related loss, or loss that we should consider in the periphery of grief. But secondary loss is really referring to perhaps there is something, a catalyst, whether that's a death, whether that's this time of pandemic. There is something that is happening that has led to many other losses. So if you can imagine a rock falling into a lake, the secondary losses would be those ripples, those things that are resulting from that initial and primary loss. And in the time of pandemic, and as we continue to deal with it, as a nation, there are so many secondary losses. This list, by all means, does not cover them all. Well, look here at some of the things that we are dealing with a loss of routine, a loss of income for those who perhaps have had to shorten work hours, leave work, have had their workplaces shut down, a loss of support networks for those who are not able to drive over to a family member's house or visit someone abroad or even have brunch with a friend who is closer by, loss of recreational activities and self-care, loss of predictability, a loss of traditions and the ways that we may have done things, especially as it pertains to death and dying and rituals, a loss of perceived peace. These are just some of the things that are not as easily tangible, but really do have a place in our grief journey, especially during this time. Loss of the assumptive world is something that many clients of mine talk about. The way in which grief and death specifically has changed their life and impacted them. Some people no longer really find hope in the day to day or joy in the day to day activities because they're thinking, well, the worst has happened. And I work with individuals to speak about how these transitions and this grief can be met head on with coping mechanisms, but also by receiving support from others who may be grieving as well. Another term that I'm inviting you all to take a moment to look at is disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief was coined by Dr. Kenneth Doka, a scholar in the field of death and dying, and really speaks to grief that is unacknowledged and unsupported within the larger society. So, three characteristics of this type of grief: it's not openly recognized, it's not socially approved, and not publicly shared. And many grievers, especially African American grievers, feel that their grief falls along these lines. Some of the things in which they are facing in their societies, some of the deaths, whether it's stigmatized death, death related to perhaps substance abuse, or death related to suicide, or death related to a variety of other means, they feel that perhaps there isn't a light that is shining on the African American experience. Now, disenfranchised grief happens and takes place in many different ways. And within the African American experience, we sort of can't talk about the way in which grief is manifests itself or manifests without looking at it under the light of racism and discrimination within this country. So many believe that disenfranchisement begins and takes root by not taking a look at systemic racism and how it plays out in many parts of the African American experience. So think on that while we discuss more about how grief manifests itself. Finally, I want you guys to think about that term culture, right? Often it's thrown around a lot. We think about the culture that our family may have. We think about the culture of the workplace. And culture is the beliefs, attitudes, values, behaviors, and practices shared by a group to support its survival within various contexts. Now, I always love that word survival because sometimes we think as culture as something that just happens organically and things fall into place, but we don't think about the part of culture that is not passive, right? The part of culture that is very much kept by a group of peoples, whether it's through oral tradition, whether it's through storytelling, whether it's through speaking about the ways in which things are experienced, to devote to the survival of those peoples, right? The keeping those beliefs and attitudes and values passing on from generation to generation. So, picking up from the way that African Americans specifically view culture or our society as large, we want to think about not so much the passive ways in which culture happens, but the ways in which culture is utilized, beliefs, attitudes are utilized in a very real way to continue on passing on behaviors and practice to a people's. So perhaps in culture, and I remember learning this in school, in grade school, about how Western culture, the culture of the United States may be, as it pertains to more individualistic way of seeing things, right? Versus a more Eastern culture or African culture, which is about the collective, which is about through their stories, through the traditions, through what speakers say, and renowned individuals within the ideology of the peoples themselves may focus on a more collective way of viewing things. And then, of course, cultures pass down through family roles, right? How one family perhaps grieves or what they find more important to them. And death rituals are definitely, certainly impacted by culture, right? What ways peoples do things, what rituals do they bring in, what songs do they sing, what verses are recited, mantras are recited around funeral services or any other type of service. So culture becomes or can become a huge part about the ways in which individuals view their grief and a people's view their grief. And again, I remind you that African Americans are not monolithic in their experience. So we're drawing on some major similarities that may be had. Rosenblatt and Wallace, in a great book, African American Grief, where they set up an introduction and hear the stories and narratives of African Americans who have experienced death, loss of someone special in their lives in a variety of different ways. But they point out in their introduction that it is really, really important when studying African American grief, when doing research pertaining to African American grief, that there is not a comparison where there is a hierarchy in which European American grief is elevated as normal and African American grief or any other types of grief are the other, quote unquote, other, right? So, in order to understand African American grief, especially in the American context, we do take a look at many studies that have been done. We do take a look at rituals. We do take a look at what is viewed as normal grief through the Western lens. But we also consider in all of those studies, there may be some biases, right? There may be some views where we are elevating or perhaps only studying a specific people's way of grieving and saying that that is the best way and that is the way in which we should do things or the model that we should follow after. So it's important that African American grief can stand on its own, right? And the uniqueness and complexities of that grief can really help us in the future, especially as clinicians, if clinicians are on today, can really help us to better tailor interventions that will meet the needs of persons who we may be speaking with in therapy sessions, in support groups, in our everyday lives, etc. As I said, we kind of can't take African American grief without first looking to the systemic racism within our great country of the United States. The Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, usually every 10 years, has goals in which they list out ways they can improve public health across the board for all peoples within the United States of America. And they point to the fact that determinants of health That terminology just refers to factors which influences an individual's or population's health. So that's what we mean when we say determinants of health. And for 2020, they came out with a list, as they usually do every decade, with ways in which they thought, and areas in which they thought would be representative of people having the most positive outcomes in their health. They listed things that you see on your screen: access to high quality education, nutritious food, decent and safe housing, affordable, reliable public transportation, culturally sensitive healthcare providers, health insurance, clean water, and non polluted air. So we have this list before us that is working towards making sure that there are more positive outcomes in health, whether that is on a community level, especially on a community level, or whether we can look at whole neighborhoods and milieux and states to improve the health of those locations. But when we think about the African American experience as it relates to public health, and as it relates to this list of ways in which we can get better health outcomes, we find, and research finds, that African Americans usually, because of the environments in which they are in, usually have more negative health outcomes. And I'll just give you some examples. For example, nutritious food. Well, when we think about, especially in cities and highly populated and dense neighborhoods, and we think about the food desert map, right? And a food desert really speaking to a neighborhood not being able to access fresh food and vegetables, and having to really, persons within that neighborhood having to go a longer way to access those things, those foods, which then contribute to better cognition, better health in mind and body. We find that African Americans usually reside in neighborhoods with these food deserts and usually do not have the access to it. We also find that many persons do not have decent and safe housing. Whether you are thinking about policies such as redlining or funding that may be for reasons over the other several reasons which are removed from Black and brown neighborhoods, and a lack of funding for schools, etc. All of these things have an effect and an impact on the positive health outcomes of the residents living within those communities. Clean water and non-populated air. We think about the areas all over the country which where children suffer the most from asthma, right? Because of a lack of clean air. And how many children are dying due to something like asthma attacks, and then not only taking this medical crisis alone, but thinking about the grief of those families and friends who have to deal with mourning a loved one. We think about Flint, Michigan, for example, where this is in recent future a clear example of some of the inequities that exist in African American neighborhoods or heavily immigrant neighborhoods. And these, it's a chain, right? These negative health outcomes, because of these inequities, lead to higher death rates, of which individuals then grieve because of what has happened in the chain before that. So, as much as we would love to say, and I myself as a practitioner would love to say, I want to take away the impacts of racism and systemic racism and discrimination away from the African American grief experience, it's almost impossible to do so when we take a look at major contributors to the grief experience. Now, there has been a rise in studies of race-based trauma, which in essence speaks to experiences of racism whether directly or indirectly. Microaggressions are part of this, right? The indirect way in which discrimination is done, in which people of African American descent are told you're less than, right? These experiences of racism, such as loss of jobs, housing deficiencies, and poverty, they're not only stressing the mind, as we may think about, right? They're not only causing negative mental health outcomes, but they may stress and are stressing the body, impacting things such as the cardiovascular system, immune systems, and other bodily systems, jeopardizing health. And that's always a wow moment to me, right? So when we think about the ways in which grief is um, manifests itself, and we experience grief as African Americans within this country, race plays a part in the trauma that we may have experienced even before someone dies, right? Impacting our bodies and our minds in a way that does not produce a positive health outcome. How else is grief impacted? We are certainly in the digital age and have been for a long while. 2020, this pandemic has shown us how we can extend far beyond our reach and how so many things are now being done online. So many of us look to the computers, social media, televisions in order to get our news about the griefs that may be experienced in this country. So the rise in technology and the rise of televised grief has the impact of vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma simply meaning that you did not directly have to be the one impacted by the trauma, but through images, through hearing, through seeing over and over again, you can experience the remnants of trauma. So we can imagine African Americans, let's use COVID-19 as a case study. African Americans who are looking at the deaths that are happening in the United States, perhaps looking at the resources that are not coming to their neighborhoods, compared to a time of pandemic and to a year like last year where there were so many things televised about police brutality and racism and its impact in our policing system. And you are watching this as an African American male, as an African American woman, a Black individual who may not be of origins within the United States, and you may be feeling that trauma of seeing someone who could possibly be friend, a brother, a sister, or family member dying over and over again in some of these reels that we see playing continually on the news. So that has an impact in which grief is experienced, right? Again, that collective, right? That idea that we are not individuals, but we operate together. And what hurts one member hurts everyone within the community. Medical racism. We recount very popular ethical cases that were based on race and discrimination, such as the Tuskegee syphilis trials, that have left a sour note in the minds and in the bodies and in the ways in which African Americans interact and relate to the medical system. So we can further think about individuals who have had experiences where they felt like they weren't able to receive the care or get the best resources. There are many research studies coming out even now about specifically mothers, Black mothers who are seeking out care, maternity care, and who are having their pain pushed to the side and say, no, 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 your pain is not being experienced in this way, and are often being told that what is happening with your body is not in actuality what is happening. So that impacts, and these stories and this research that comes out impacts the way in which people grieve. And African Americans can form an overall distrust of the larger society at large, medical system, because of their experiences with the medical system. Being assigned to hazardous work. We take a year like 2020 and ongoing, where many immigrants, where many Black and Brown persons, African persons, are essential workers in all different fields. Some fields which they cannot easily translate or transition to the mode of utilizing Zoom. So that takes an impact of not feeling that there is a choice in whether or not you can go to work or stay home or take sick, because you may, for financial reasons, need to go to work. And we think about those many public health outcomes, right? To gain food, to have further access to resources, transporting yourself. Perhaps you're transporting yourself not in the safest mode of transportation, taking the trains or buses, where you're being exposed to something like the virus. And then that has an impact going into grief. Poverty, discrimination that grievers may be aware of or were recounted to them by the person who is deceased, may really impact the ways in which they view their grief. Complicated in the way that they're thinking, my loved one wasn't given a chance. If this did not happen, if they did not face this discrimination, if they did not face this racism, perhaps they could have been here today. And I am often recounted of some of those stories. And even while individuals grieve, some of the things which are happening in their neighborhoods or impact their ability to be able to pursue justice has an impact on their grief. I recall working with a client whose child died due to vehicular accident. So their child was hit by a car. And this client, one of the ways in which they chose to make a meaning was trying to make sure that within their community, there were stop signs. Within their community, there was a light and the intersection that their child was struck and killed. But this client, as part of their grief narrative, often recounted the struggle that they felt that they were up against, the discrimination that they felt that they were up against because of a neighborhood which was lower in socioeconomic class. So they would often say, Rashida, I feel like this would not be happening in another neighborhood. I would not have to be jumping through hoops and talking to my councilman and getting petitions. And someone else may die, and I have to explain why, and I have to talk about my grief and open that up over and over again. Where perhaps in another neighborhood with less individuals who are African American, there would be more clout. There would be more of an ability to say, these are the reasons that we should have a stoplight here, and the community organize behind them, or be able to have the finances to do that. So that's just an example of how an individual's grief can be marred and they can experience the grief in light of discrimination and in light of what they believe is unfair treatment of their own community. Now, myths of being strong and resiliency. I love to talk about this with my African American clients and have candid conversation about this myth of being strong. I often hear that within African American, within Black grievers who seek out help when they are feeling extremely overwhelmed, when they are feeling like their back is against the wall, and their grief is perhaps getting in the way of their day to day functioning. And after many individuals, I hear the words, I'm supposed to be strong, or I'm trying to be strong. Or even if it's not coming from the mouths of the clients themselves, they speak about the messages, whether overt or covertly, that they receive from their Black communities about strength, about being able to grit their teeth and bear it, about being able to get through grief. And in essence, it becomes that it's not speaking about grief, they are being strong. While we see what trauma and grief and inequities and discrimination does to the body and mind. So these persons are often finding such freedom in being told that this is a myth, that holding on to ideals of being quote unquote strong and not talking about the very deep and real pain of grief and supports or lack of supports or discrimination experience or racism that may be part of your story, or feeling the freedom to speak about their loved one, the special person whom has died, how that is really negatively impacting them and bringing about poor health outcomes. And they are often so happy to hear that, and I frame it in this way, that in meeting your feelings, in talking about them, in giving space to your grief, you are showing strength that perhaps others cannot. And just hearing that statement again, so freeing, so freeing. And I often draw to mind and help these clients recall, and often try to remind myself that mental health services and speaking about these topics so freely in these United States of America were not always the norm. And for many, it's still not the norm. For many, there is great stigma because of what they believe may happen to them, or the treatment they may believe will result from going to medical professionals. For many, it's about feeling that those whom they speak to, whether in mental health, whether in medicine, may not understand their stories and how it is specific to the African American experience. And for others, the history is something, again, within culture, right? That was passed down from people who were segregated, passed down from Jim Crow laws, passed down from Reconstruction, passed down from slavery, where you were not readily able to get access and talk about your grief. As a matter of fact, a part of dehumanization was not attending to one's grief and moving past that. And we fail to realize how sometimes and oftentimes that culture of being strong and being resilient by not speaking contributes to more negative health outcomes. So we want to debunk that myth, and I love to debunk that myth and encourage individuals to speak about their grief and how it is that they are experiencing it, not only in their individual experience, but in their community at large. Many African Americans, because of systemic racism, do not have the possibility to be financially literate from a young age, right? So they may have individuals who are dying in their lives and are not quite aware of how it is that they can fill out documents that are needed or that are important in the medical field, such as healthcare proxies, or they may not be able to understand or be able to turn to someone who can sort of help them within their own communities about how to deal with financial assets, estates, and that can become very overwhelming for any griever, let alone someone who feels that they are already behind the ball in what they know about assets and handling the finances of their loved one. The somaticization of grief. Another way to say the ways in which grief is physically experienced through the body, right? That's why I put up that slide of racial trauma and the study of that. The ways in which grief impacts mind, the body, the spirit holistically, but then not being able, perhaps as an African American person, an individual, to feel that you can speak about your grief and you can be understood within your community or outside of it, can leave those emotions and can leave those feelings manifesting themselves in other ways in the body. High blood pressure, hair falling out. I had a client who knew that she needed additional grief support and reached out to someone in her community by saying, "My hair is falling out. I am not myself. My appetite is impacted. My blood pressure is going up." And much of that was feeling that I don't have the outlet to be able to speak about my grief and how it's impacting me. So that somatization of grief is very, very important. And it's important in response to being strong, right? Because many individuals think, well, I am strong in the sense that I am not talking about this, right? And I am moving on. I am prospering to whatever may be coming over me. But if they knew or perhaps received some psychoeducation on how their body was being impacted, and that it was directly correlated to the grief that they were experiencing, many people would be more interested in saying, okay, speaking about this is a balm to the body. Speaking and talking about this is a way of me increasing my health outcome and being able to share with others this pain that I'm experiencing. Speaking my own truth and my story is a way for me to transform grief and work through it. So that's very important to remember about how grief is experienced in the body. How do we make meaning in grief? How do African Americans make meanings in grief? Black individuals within this country make meaning in grief. It's far and wide. These are just three of the ones that have come over and over again in literature as it relates to grief in African Americans. Firstly, have to realize that many African Americans, by ways of the experiences of racism and discrimination within the country overall, many African Americans speak about their grief and gain social support in culturally segregated environments. What do you mean by that, Rashida? I knew you would ask. So it's proven that African Americans, especially as it pertains to their grief, whether it's from death and dying, or whether it's from things such as many losses that they are experiencing through pandemics, when those secondary losses, whether it is through that vicarious trauma of seeing images and deaths of other African Americans happening on their television screen or hearing about it. many individuals who are African Americans speak about how important it is for them to go to safe spaces where there are other African Americans who are speaking and talking about or writing, if it's online, about their grief experiences. So many people and individuals within the last year who are African American have expressed how they felt that what was going on in their private lives or within their homes, within their families with loss, they perhaps did not have the space to express that in their workplace, or it wasn't readily spoken about. But where was it being talked about? It was being talked about within Black congregations, where perhaps they were going in 2020 online to these services where social issues were being spoken about, as well as a bringing of a spiritual word from leaders. Individuals speak to me about Black organizations, whether it is African Americans in healthcare, African Americans and mental health, speaking to other coworkers who were African American. They were speaking about the experience of what their grief was and how it was taking shape in this environment, again, in which they felt safe. And in the digital age, one of the fastest growing ways in which people, African Americans specifically, are speaking about their grief is online. You have the onset and you have now the terminology of words such as Black Twitter, right? No, Twitter did not, go and create a subgroup and has a company. But what you found is that African Americans began through the sharing of tweets, through the sharing of images, through the sharing of song and pictures, began to use specific hashtags which utilize vernacular that was well known within the culture, which utilize words that many African Americans knew and movements that they knew and could stand behind to express the grief of what they were seeing. So it's not uncommon to hear someone see something, and this has happened several times to me, where you see something and it's unbelievable to see what has happened on your television screen, and you're really beginning to feel that vicarious trauma to go online and to go to Instagram and to go to Twitter and to go to Facebook and specifically seek out a hashtag or go through a major page of Black culture, Black pop culture, where you knew that these images and hashtags and words of encouragement were being pulled from everywhere across the internet. It's often said that humor is one of the ways in which people counter the great depth of pain and grief in which they are feeling. So I have seen time and time again African Americans flock to the digital space and are really watching over those spaces and making sure that they continue to be space so that they can online express themselves, not with the community that may be right outside their door, but with the larger community that may understand what they are going through in their grief. So it speaks again to that individual grief being intertwined with that collective loss. We all feel it. I can go on and to these sites and say how COVID is impacting me. I can go on after someone like Chadwick Boseman has died, lead actor in Black Panther, a movie that African Americans are so proud of, to have a black superheroes out there, and people flock to theaters. So his death was impactful. I can go online and see people uplift him and say how his life contributed to their children's lives, their lives, believing in themselves. I can go on and see at the 1 year anniversary of Kobe Bryant's death to see how others are reflecting upon his life and how young African American men and women are being impacted not only by his death, but also by the way in which he lived his life. So the digital space becomes all the more important when we perhaps can't have face-to-face conversations. And even when we can, so many look for those safe spaces and look for those specifically Black organizations in which they can kind of express parts of the grief that they would not necessarily talk about with many others. And finally, the religious and spiritual space, whether that is the quote unquote Black church, or whether that is in the many other ways that African Americans hold a spirituality and call upon ancestors and speak about being impacted by those who came before them, and see that as a way in which they can make meaning and they can continue. I cannot tell you the countless times I have heard individuals speak about they're not having a funeral, but they're having a homegoing service. This is a time where they can both recognize their grief, but they can also attend to the fact that this is a celebration of that individual's life. And not only a celebration of their life, but how their life impacts and moves forward the communities that they are a part of. So that collective thinking about grief and about the ways in which individuals led their lives come up over and over again in the way in which African Americans make meaning. Now, for clinicians and for anyone else who may be looking to just hone in on their skills, or maybe thinking, what do I say to someone who is grieving, who is African American specifically, who may be in my life, or am I an African American who wants to go deeper in a conversation with persons within my community and around me? I first of all want you to remember all the things that we spoke about under the definition of grief. So those things are universal, right? That holistic experience. So it is okay to ask someone, "How are you feeling today? Tell me about your special person. How did they impact your life?" African Americans especially love the use of metaphor and story, that narrative, that speaking truth to power, as it's often said, is so important, because for centuries it was through the spoken word, it was through oration, it was through stories that messages were given, right, within the culture. So many grievers love to be able to have that space to speak about their special person, to have the chance to say, well, this is how they impacted me. This is how they affected my life. This is what I have gained from their life. And then in turn, you can utilize that to say, what is missing them like? Where is that grief stemming from? Is it missing those special moments with them? Is it missing looking up to a mentor? So there are so many ways in which you can give a griever the space to be able to lead you in what their story is and how their grief is taking shape. And counselors also have to be self-aware, right? I think it's a word that's thrown around sometimes very haphazardly, self-aware. But what are we asking people to be aware of? Well, first of all, recognizing what is coming up in your internal dialogue, right? When a person of African American descent is speaking to you, um, are you able to um, really, even if you're not understanding their experience or their experience, their grief in life of racism or discrimination, or you cannot maybe understand your privilege, or the ways in which you are privileged are different from theirs, right? Think about and recognize the things that are coming to mind, the internal dialogue, and manage that dialogue. Uh, Curiosity is needed, but never to put someone on the stage as if they have to explain things to you. But in a gentle way, you can speak to, I don't understand. And you can validate when something is shared with you by saying, your experience um, matters to me, and I want to learn more about it. Mindfulness and meditation are very helpful in the ways in which individuals view the body connection, right? Being able to attend to that breath, being able to notice what is going on with pains and aches in your body, whirling thoughts, etc. And support groups, speaking to that collective, right? Are ways in which people can share and feel heard. And finally, as we're going to move on to our Q&A portion, I can't wait to hear what you all have to say and ask. I leave you with this poem by Maya Angelou, or a snippet from a poem entitled The Mask by Maya Angelou. And she speaks here directly to the African American grief experience. And she says things such as, we wear the mask that grins and lies. It shades our cheeks and hides our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile with torn and bleeding hearts. We smile and mouth the myriad subtleties. Why should the world think otherwise? In counting all our tears and sighs. Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. For many, such powerful words. For many, that is the African American grief experience. Feeling that they are behind a metaphorical mask, and even more recently, 2020 has shown us a physical mask, a hiding of what their experience is. And I hope, if this lecture can contribute to anyone researching or feeling validated or saying, my experience is unique and stands on its own, or I learned something about this experience, then we would have taken steps towards removing a little bit of that mask that happens in grief and being more freely able to speak and talk about it. So thank you for all those who listen, and I'll turn it over to Ayana, who's going to lead out with our question and answer portion.
Thank you so much, Rashida. That was a fabulous presentation. You covered so much. It was so interesting to hear. And really, I was struck by thinking about kind of the role of racism and trauma in regards to grief, and also this collective loss that we feel too. It made me think about Emmett Till. It made me think about Martin Luther King and his passing, and also how it galvanized communities when we have this loss and we feel like we want to take action. So it's really interesting to think about that perspective. Thank you. So for those of you who have questions, I encourage you to enter them into the Q&A. And I think we have one question there, Rashida, if you see it.
Yes, I do see a question here, which states, as a hospice nurse, I wanted to ask, what are some suggestions for creating a safe, trusting environment for my African American clients and families? No, I identify as a Caucasian woman. And it says, mainly, I try to approach people as the individuals they are with their unique experiences. And thank you for that question. You are certainly on the right track, right? It is important to never assume, right? And this is why that's been repeated several times within this experience. And I never want individuals to feel that they are only being viewed through the collective. So asking what your grief means to you. If those individuals are speaking with you and engaging you in conversation, or you're thinking about how to engage them further, you can ask, and begin someplace like, how are you feeling today? How is your grief impacting you? How has it changed the life of your family, your friends? You can even reach into the supports that they have. And you may find some surprises about how those supports aren't always in family or in friendship groups, but how they're a reflection of the larger community. So that may be an opportunity to further draw those persons out. Because I don't know about you all, right? Who doesn't love to talk about support and the good things that are happening? So it's good to be able to validate individuals in that area while also saying, I may not understand all parts of your story and your process, but I thank you for sharing it with me. It's important. It's changed me. And I do think that people truly appreciate that.
Thanks. And I also wanted to ask a question about COVID specifically. I mean, how do you think the process, how we're managing the process related to COVID and death and loss compared to other deaths and experiences we've had in the past, kind of this a pandemic? How do you think it's impacting grief in the African American community?
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Ayana. And actually, two of the articles that will be sent out to our viewers today are around that topic, around this anticipation that grief for the population will be complicated and will be prolonged because people are not able to follow through with their own rituals, gain the supports that they want. But specifically in African American communities, how we are finding that uh, the inequities are magnified, not only with the inability to feel supported about going into physical spaces, whether that's work or travel, whether you are living with individuals where you can't quarantine from. We have to understand that many African American households are multi-generational, right? So it may not be as easy to quarantine and you have a larger space where you can do that. But also, people are heavily watching medicine and the way in which they relate to it. More recently, even in New York City, the vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines in New York City, their board came under a lot of pushback, I would say, because there was a little bit of lack of equity in the ways in which the vaccine was being distributed. So they've done some great stuff to counter that by saying we want to make sure that this vaccine is available to the people within Black and Brown and African American communities so that they can have access to this essential moving towards getting out of this time of pandemic.
Mhm.
I see some more questions here. Wonderful. Um, Gordon states, due to the volume of disenfranchised death, African Americans haven't given ourselves spaces to grieve. And due to this volume, we are now grieving for future losses we know not of. Yet, know that is inevitable. How do we grieve for the past while being cognizant of what the future holds? Oh, great question, Gordon. And it's wonderful and powerful because as disenfranchised grievers, and I do absolutely agree with you that African American grief often has that duality of grieving for the present and especially when around trauma, grieving for the next generation, right? I think that's often why we look to what our forefathers have done and how many African Americans got these speeches about you will do something, you will become great. We have these words of positivity that are constantly breathed into us. And those words, we grow up with an understanding that those words are not for the individual. Yes, you benefit. Yes, your family benefits. But how can you come back to the community and how can you contribute back to the community? So I think in a way, when we see griefs that specifically have to do with racism, systemic racism that have to do with discrimination. We grieve for the here and now, but we move towards trying to impact policies, trying to speak to younger children, trying to prepare them so that they will not have to go through the same griefs that we went through. So it's a fluid process. It's an ongoing process that involves a lot of conversation and not brushing away, right? Bringing to the spotlight these subjects that we most certainly need to talk about. Another question: what would you suggest to make this topic of death as a known happening to discuss within one's family? Avery, that I always tell people, the place to start is in your own family. And I know it sounds cliche. I know it sounds like, oh man, that's not doing much. But I am a true believer that if you can begin to have these candid conversations around death and loss and grief with your own family members and break down barriers there, and then move to perhaps your friendship groups and speak about your own experiences. What helped you? Well, this is what I talked about. This is what grandma said. She's not talking about death, and on and on. Then it really diffuses to creating a culture that speaks about death more. So you can speak about it face to face in your own family, and you can contribute to the digital culture around it as well, where you're putting stuff up about mental health or about grief, and you're normalizing it for not just your family, but your own little fan base of whomever is following you.
And I would suggest you could share this recording on your social media as well of this presentation with your loved ones in your network.
Yes, do that. Thank you, Lana. And I have a question here that says, as a social worker in the hospital setting, we often have to educate other staff about grief expressions of our African American families when a loved one dies, and have even had to intervene in security being called because families are being, quote, disruptive. Can you talk about grief expression, perhaps suggest some resources for continued learning? Absolutely. Let me get to the suggestions first. A book that I think is great, I mentioned before, and full of stories of African American grief and the ways in which they experience it, is African American Grief by Paul Rosenblatt and Beverly Wallace. And also, I am a big fan of Handbook of Social Justice in Loss and Grief. That handbook by Tashelle Bourdier, edited by Tashelle Bourdier and Darcy Harris, doesn't only speak to the African American experience, but speaks to the overall experience of the marginalized individuals who have traditionally been discriminated against. And that shows up about how African Americans may relate to the medical system as an entity that perhaps doesn't understand even their expressions of grief. That cultural sensitivity, that cultural competence is needed. I'm so glad that you as a social worker are able to see it. I hope that you're calling it out, not just intervening, but impacting policies that really say that this is death, this is dying, this is grief. There is no one way to experience it, and we should not penalize people for experiencing it in a way that is different from us. So those two books are a great place to start, and inviting people, maybe putting it on yourself, just a webinar, a seminar about cultural competence, and how sometimes our day-to-day actions, which perhaps we don't think have an impact, are indeed the stuff our organizations are made of, right? So thank you for your question. Oh, someone wanted a technical question. What does the FT stand for in your name at the start of the presentation? It stands for Fellow in Thanatology. So it's this certificate is given through the Association of Death Education and Counseling, ADEC for short. And it is one that professionals, social workers, clinicians, mental health counselors, etc., can pursue, and shows that they have the clinical hours and experience in the field of death and dying. Um, Gordon says, are you and other institutions working with death doulas? If so, how and to what extent? And if not, why not? You know, Gordon, I through my organization have not worked with death doulas, but I have met some wonderful death doulas who are doing the work of accompanying individuals in their the trajectory of their illness and dying. It certainly is an important work. I know the organization Reimagine, which I'm more familiar with, Reimagine End of Life, has had some great programs that have been sponsored and subjects that have been touched on that have been hosted by death doulas. So I hope that you can look into that as a means to get more information.
And I think someone asked about the books you mentioned, so we can email that out with the recording as well, with the full titles and authors for everyone.
Yes, I certainly will provide that.
Are there any other questions people want to type into the chat? I know we're hitting 6:45.
We want to be respectful of everyone's time. I thank everyone who has stayed on.
Yeah, thank you for staying with us. Before we wrap up, Rashida, do you have any final thoughts or information you'd like to share with the audience?
Yes, you know, again, I think that this work, if looked at as many lines of research that you can do, and you can almost feel like you're going down the rabbit hole. So I always encourage people to start with what interests you. Start where you are. African American grief has always interested me. It has inspired me. It has helped me to meet audiences and reflect and meet people that I have had the opportunity to do so here. But I started where I saw a need, right? So death, dying, and the subjects and matters of grief are far and wide in between. For some, it may be a love of working with children because they've seen how children are disenfranchised. For some, one of our participants here, you may be noticing something going on in your hospital setting or at your workplace, and that's your starting point. So I encourage you to start somewhere. That matters, right? And I leave it there with that message because we can make a difference. And whether you're African American or not, or identify as African American or from another ethnicity, from another culture, you can, this work is not exclusively for just one group of people. So wherever you're seeing injustice, wherever you're seeing a way where you can make it easier for someone to reflect and talk about their grief and other subjects, do so.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. It was wonderful. So if Rashida didn't get a chance to answer your question or you think of something later, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can email us at info@endoflifechoicesny.org, or you can visit our website and submit your question there. Also, to learn more about Calvary Hospital, you can also go to their website, calvaryhospital.org. So that concludes our event. Thank you again, Rashida, for taking the time to speak with us today and for raising awareness about experiences of grief and available support. And thank you to everyone watching for sharing your time with us today. I hope you will join us again at an upcoming event. Once again, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. We have periodic events on very interesting topics such as this. And also, as I mentioned, we're going to continue to educate professionals. I see we have a couple professionals on here. In terms of social workers, we provide a lot of opportunities to learn more about death and dying as well. So take care and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you again to Rashida. I give you applause. So I know that everybody wants to give you applause.
Thank you.
And good night to everyone. Thank you again.